I want to shift a couple minutes and talk a little bit about the K through 12 environment, because you have kids, they call them whatever, digital babies, whatever you want to call them. They've grown up with this stuff, and the Tower in the Cloud document I sent you earlier kind of talks a little bit more about students arriving on campus with like this whole infrastructure built up around them, like using Facebook, Twitter, all these kind of things, and then getting into a classroom where that's not used. And the question that he asks is, okay, well, how do you deal with the students trying to use these things in their current classroom, but they didn't use them before in their classroom? Most K through 12, you turn it off and you take it out. Do you see maybe a push in the K through 12 area to bring more technology into the classroom, or do you see that as like a extremely rigid thing that's going to take years to change?
I won't speak to what's actually happening in those classrooms because I don't know. I don't know enough about that. I can totally understand a situation in which a K-12 teacher says turn it off and put it away and totally cuts off the sort of connections to the cloud during their classroom for any number of reasons. One being, being held responsible for your students' test scores and thus having to teach to various tests, or having a couple hundred students run through your room every day, right, that you're responsible for, that you have to grade and evaluate in some way. The sort of workload of a typical K through 12 teacher is insane. So there's all kinds of reasons institutionally why someone would do that, because it's just one more thing to have to sort of deal with in the classroom. Given that, what I guess I want to say about this sort of narrative of digital youth, or whatever, born digital people, is that the assumption seems to be often that because students are on Facebook, because students are on Twitter, because they can upload a video to YouTube or whatever, they're somehow digitally literate. I mean, my thinking on this has changed over the years. My current position on this is that they're really good at being users. That doesn't make someone digitally literate. What that means is they know how to use software, or they know how to use technology. And hopefully that means that they know how to kind of push its boundaries and use it in ways maybe that wasn't intended, or be creative with it. Sometimes it doesn't mean that. Sometimes it means that they really just know how to do very basic things. Do they understand how it was put together or how it works? Unless they're going into a computer science classroom or a computer engineering classroom, no, they don't. They have very little understanding of it, and we don't have any system in place at the K through 12 level to get students thinking about that, right?
Right.
How was this technology put together? How does it work? How does programming even work? Though this is something I've become much more interested in the last couple of years, as I start to think about how, if a liberal education is supposed to teach someone sort of how to be the whole person, right? So you get a little philosophy, you get a little English, you get a little science, you get a little math. That's sort of basic gist of K through 12 education. Although, again, there's a push to professionalize even at that level, right? Almost people are picking majors in high school, right? But set that aside for now. If that's the case, then why isn't programming a part of that? If, in fact, we're going to be asked to deal with these technologies on a daily basis and use them and interact with them, why aren't people being taught how they're put together? That doesn't mean everyone has to be a computer engineer, but it does we at least have to be taught how to think carefully about how these things are put together, how they're shaping the way we interact with each other. So this the narrative of the kind of digitally literate student that we have to sort of meet on their own terms, that they understand more about this stuff than we do, et cetera, I don't actually think that that's true. I think a lot about my students who, when they hit a lot of times when my students hit a kind of brick wall with technology, their first instinct is to email me and ask a question. Now that's, I think, for two reasons. One, it's school related, and that means they've been trained that if something goes wrong that's school related, you contact the teacher. But it's also that they have not, perhaps, they don't think about technology as something that you explore and that you tinker with and that you try to solve problems with. So how do we cultivate that kind of ethic?
So would you and you kind of hinted at this I think earlier when you talked about the guy who had the finance degree and the philosophy major, that being a digital kid has in a lot of ways taken out and taken away your ability to think critically about problems. That you're constantly, if you want to know a question to something, you can just ask someone instead of trying to think about how that actually works.
I wouldn't make that argument. I think a lot of people do make that argument. I think what I think is great about that situation is that the student knows if they know where to go for the answer, that's for me almost as good as, that's for me part of being a critical citizen, if that's what the word we want to use. So, the argument that a lot of people make is, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, you had to go to the library and sort of find your way through the stacks and get an answer to your question. And I see that argument, and I get it. I don't think that but think about then, so that's true, that's changed. But think about then what someone can do now, that they don't have to go to the stacks and pull books off the shelves. Well, if in fact they have that information at their fingertips, and they know how to discern the good from the bad or the reliable from the unreliable, then what can they do with that information? The task becomes not finding it, but creating something with it. So just yesterday we were in my class talking about making mashups and what the point of making a mashup is and why someone would want to create it. So we don't have to go digging through a sort of dusty archive to find material to mash up. We can go to YouTube and find a bunch of videos and see what we've got out there, and within minutes have a mashup. That doesn't mean it's going to be any good. That doesn't mean it's going to actually communicate anything. Doesn't mean that there's been any research done on the sort of source material that you are mashing up and its historical significance. Those are all the things that we can then cultivate, right? That we can teach in the classroom, so that it's not about finding the information. It's about the information's there. It's about discerning what is valuable, and then what do we do with it? You don't have to memorize it anymore, right? Because it's there. Well, okay, we don't have to memorize it. What do we use that brain power for?
Right. So you're not seeing I guess you're not seeing a decline in the. Yes, you can go out and find the information, but I've heard this from professors in the business school that Wayne State students dance around the answer and they get so close, but they have such a hard time connecting the dots. And I hear that less now that I'm in the graduate school. I heard it more when I was in the undergraduate school. Do you see any of that where it's, you're really good at finding the information that you need, but you're not quite great at making that information say something that doesn't necessarily say right in front of you?
See, I think that, I can't speak to how things were 30 years ago, but that strikes me as a very old problem, that this was always the problem, that students, so like a research paper for, say, an undergraduate often ends up just being a kind of review of the literature, because the actual hardest step is actually figuring out what to do with the stuff once you find it, right? So in the old days, you would compile all the information, maybe, but you still would really just report on it, rather than figure out, say, a position, as you said, connecting the dots, putting this together in some new way. You can look at this sort of contemporary environment as kids these days don't know how to do research, or you can look at it as, well, what if, you still have to do research. Just because you're pulling it up on the Wayne State webpage through your browser doesn't mean you still have to understand how the library is laid out, how databases work, how search terms work, what journals are worth looking at, which aren't, what books are worth looking at, which aren't. All of that is still research. You don't have to dig through the dusty old books to do research, right? But for me, you look at it as a sort of, it's an opportunity, so that the actual step of research may be not easier, but maybe the research is more accessible. So now maybe we can focus more of our time on connecting the dots, what to do with it. Am I seeing, I haven't been around long enough to talk about trends, right?
Right.
50 years from now, maybe I'll be able to talk about what students could do, what I saw them able to do now, what they do in the future. But I think people are too quick to blame all these things on either the students themselves or the technologies, and that's partially because they don't understand the technologies, they don't themselves use them, they want to teach in ways that they've always taught.
Talking real quick about that, it's probably be one of our last ones here. What what are the ghost stories that exist of like cloud computing and maybe like the humanities department or academia as a whole? Because there is a pushback.
You mean like the sort of paranoia?
Yeah. What's the typical paranoia? The typical
Yeah.
answer? Like, what are the typical concerns that the key power holders, the key decision
Sure.
maker to move forward have?
Okay, I would say that the number one thing I hear about something like cloud computing, and people won't even use that term, right? They use other terms. I think that's a term that's in humanities departments. Most people would look at you cross-eyed if you said cloud computing.
Right.
The number one thing I hear about are privacy concerns, and along these same lines, concerns about blanking on the name of the piece of legislation at this point, but the legislation that protects student information. So, for instance, the reason people default to things like Blackboard is that it's behind a password and it's protected, and you can post things like grades there, right? Without being worried about being FERPA is what I was thinking about, right? So FERPA legislation is what people are very worried about in terms of.
But Blackboard is still technically, under my definition, I would still consider it part of the cloud.
It depends on how you define it, right? So, I mean, it is part of the cloud, but it's also accessible in totally different ways.
Right.
I mean, my dad works for Blackboard, and we have all kinds of battles at family dinners about the limits of Blackboard because, for me, Blackboard is a bunch of siloed data that students can't then make connections between. Blackboard recreates that 19th century model you were talking about before. How do you access your classes on Blackboard? Well, you have to go to the point. Yeah. So the point I was making is, to one way around the problem of plagiarism is to design assignments that are difficult to plagiarize. In that same move, you're not only making things that are difficult to plagiarize, you're hopefully making things that are more worthwhile and more important. That being said, if in fact you want to assign a paper that students can find a version of online, and I think there are reasons to say to students, like, I know you can go find this online, a version of this argument. I don't want you to do that. I want you to make your version of it. I think that's a legitimate response to the problem of plagiarism. Then you've got to figure out a way to motivate them to do that. And for me, it's about motivating them to do it and not about signing up for, say, Blackboard Safe Assign, where you just plug a paper in and it tells you 50% of this paper is from other texts, and then you have to decide, well, is that 50% from citations or is it plagiarized? And that's not my approach to the problem. My approach is, how do I get students to see the value in what it is that I want them to do so that they don't go plagiarize it. Now, there's no way around, and I openly tell students this because I want them to know that I know it's possible. There's no way around them. I can't stop them from handing the assignment to someone else and having them do it. But I can't fathom a way in which one would prevent that. And so I tell them, like, I can't stop you from doing that. I don't want you to do that.
Right.
Yeah, that's it.
So then, with that idea in mind, you think of different ways to assign them. Would you say that the cloud, or whatever you want to call it, the internet, all this information is, in a way, forced you to become a better educator?
I would say, the way I have approached it is as an opportunity, right? Has it forced me to rethink the kinds of things I assign? I don't know if it's part of the matrix for me. It's part of how I figure out what I want students to do in the classroom, or outside the classroom for that matter. But, this is not, so I wouldn't say that that's the approach that I took strictly because of technology. But I would say that that sort of what's available to them certainly is part of that equation. Like, how do I motivate them is very much linked to how easy it is for them to go online and get X, Y, and Z.
Okay. Well, thanks, Jim.
Sure.
Appreciate your time.
Thank you.